Chapter 15. A New Colleague, or What Therapeutic Exercise Can Teach Us. And so the Institute was broken up, though this did not make life much easier for Dr. Buteyko. He still had a deadly enemy close at hand who had no intention of laying down his weapons. But still, he could breathe a bit more freely. Of course, the 75% cut in his staff made itself felt, but he just had to look for a way out of the situation. It was at this difficult time that he chanced to meet a specialist in therapeutic exercise whom, after long conversation, he invited to swell the laboratory's depleted ranks. Natalia Voronova knew about Dr. Buteyko's work from articles published by the Institute for Experimental Medicine. His idea that deep breathing provokes bronchial spasm in asthmatics had shaken her to the core. At that time, the middle of 1963, she was working in the Kemerovo Sports Clinic in central Siberia, mostly in therapeutic exercise. Her choice of profession was no accident. She was herself a champion gymnast, had taken part in the first post-war USSR sports parade, and graduated from the Lesgaft Institute of Physical Education in Leningrad in 1957. Ever since, she committed her life to helping people get well through holistic sport and to therapeutic exercise in general. She knew better than anyone that all contemporary therapeutic exercise was based on breathing deeply. However, she couldn't help observing that some patients did not respond well by any means. More than once, she was astonished to see patients with pulmonary and cardiac complaints start fighting for breath even more desperately than before, despite all her efforts and her constant refrain of "take a deep breath, take a deep breath." When this happened, what surprised her most was that patients felt far worse when they began breathing deeply from a standstill. Breathing deeply came easier when they were physically exerting themselves, but the orthodox guidelines of the time said that every exercise should begin with hands on the hips and approximately 1 minute so-called prophylactic ventilation of the lungs. Form a straight line, hands on hips, and breathe in. Breathe in as deeply as you can. Ventilate your lungs. She'd repeat this day in, day out, and it was only after ventilating their lungs like this that the asthmatics would start their exercises proper. There was a countrywide compulsion to take a deep breath, and so Buteyko's "don't breathe deeply" came like a bolt from the blue. It wasn't that Natalia instantly believed in the doctor, but she was so astonished at his discovery and so troubled by her own growing doubts that she wrote to him asking if she could come and talk about everything that was worrying her face to face. At the very end of October, when the doctor was just back from his work trip and still trying to patch up the gaps in his technical equipment left by Professor Pomyakin, she stepped into the doorway. Something about her blonde athleticism, her medium build, and her youthful energy immediately caught his attention. It could have been her firm handshake, or the frank, alert look of her attentive grey eyes. Probably it was her genuine delight when she caught sight of the famous combine complexator from the doorway. She had the unpretentiousness characteristic of many sportspeople. At the invitation of its creator, she carefully walked round the special little couch in its tiny cubicle, curtained from view, plastered with its plethora of wires and instruments. A high forehead and a Ukrainian smock showing under his lab coat were the first things that struck new acquaintances about Buteyko's appearance, in addition to the youthful skin of someone who did not smoke. They talked for a long time. Natalia Voronova asked what she should do in future. According to Dr. Buteyko's theory, everything she had done to date was wrong. One moment putting on his glasses, the next taking them off, Buteyko told her quite candidly about the results of his research. She was even surprised by his frankness. It was not usual to bare your soul in the academic world, and they were not just talking about medical matters. Buteyko talked about his method for consciously reducing the depth of one's breathing, and about what the world normally considers healthy. He believed that one of the main causes of wars in our highly stressed and volatile world was deep breathing by the people who instigated them. Just think, Buteyko leant back in his chair and pushed his white cap to the back of his head, revealing neatly combed hair as he did so. Just think The bloodbath in South Vietnam has gone on for 9 years already. Ngo Dinh Diem's dictatorship abetted by US regular forces. What do you reckon? Are all these people breathing normally?" Natalia primped her hair coquettishly. "I assure you that the head men of all these hordes, and the cannon fodder too, for the most part suffer from mental deficiencies brought on by constant over-breathing. It's all very simple." Buteyko's piercing eyes gleamed quizzically under his glasses. "Deep breathing does not increase the volume of oxygen in the body, it decreases it, and cerebral hypoxia sets in as a result. And when the brain starts getting less oxygen than it needs, it starts to function less well, and quite naturally a person grows duller. And a peace-loving population starts exterminating over 150,000 people who had themselves triggered some local, utterly parochial little war. Those statistics stick in my memory from an article in the press, and they start wounding and taking hostage 670,000 more." "He has a terrific memory," Natalia found herself thinking as she listened to him, rapt. "And throwing hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese in jail, 8,000 of them children." Dr Buteyko gave his head an unnatural twist, as though his neck was in an invisible noose. "And torturing and murdering nuns, and raping 15,000 South Vietnamese women. Did you see those people immolate themselves on TV?" He suddenly broke off. "Those were awful pictures." Natalia covered her face with her hands. "One after another, 6 people poured petrol over themselves and set themselves alight in public places in protest against all the lawlessness." The doctor was on his high horse with indignation. "What do you reckon? Could rational beings drive people to do this? Whatever the politicians say, it's completely clear to me as a doctor that only individuals with diminished rationality could be so savage. The USA, you know, is a very right-thinking country, and in time I think they will appreciate the senselessness of their bloodletting in Vietnam. But all this could have been avoided completely if the human brain had not been occluded by deep breathing. Excessive greed and a bestial thirst for flesh and blood, these two are what hyperventilation brings us. Hyper means in excess of the norm, and here we are overturning all our normal structures and beliefs, moral and ethical. I haven't frightened you, have I?" the doctor asked, with a gentle smile. "No, of course not. What you say obviously makes definite sense," Natalia said, and pulled her pale blue sports bag closer to her feet. "As for you," Buteyko stared at the Olympic rings on its side, "we need young, enthusiastic people." Natalia blushed with embarrassment. "Yes, young people, with open minds, because this is a new field. I can offer you a place in my laboratory." A heart leapt. "True, only—" Buteyko paused, and Natalia waited on tenterhooks. "Our salaries are low, and we could only offer you 98 rubles a month." Buteyko whipped off his glasses and looked her straight in the eye. "How much do you get at the clinic?" "A therapeutic exercise specialist counts as 1.5 posts, so I get slightly more. But I'll say yes," Natalia said, without thinking. She still couldn't believe her luck, but the doctor was serious. She was indeed taken on at the Laboratory of Functional Diagnostics, and not once did she regret it. Nor did Buteyko. He had other doctors, of course, but the young therapeutic exercise specialist really interested him because school physical education was where it all started. "Take a deep breath. 1, 2, 3, and they were off. Overbreathe, my dears. Fall ill more often." To have a therapeutic exercise specialist on the team and make them a confirmed opponent of deep breathing would be no bad thing. His hopes were justified. Not only did Natalia hold her own, but 18 months later she was able to go at Dr Buteyko's behest to one of the leading asthma treatment centres in the country, with a low success rate unfortunately, and conduct a semi-official trial of Buteyko's method with extremely positive results for the patients. Everyone in the laboratory accepted Natalia Voronova as one of their own. Apart from her, there were 2 other doctors, 2 young mathematicians and 1 physicist. Most of the 6 laboratory staff and doctors were women. 2 of the young chaps took evening classes in the biology faculty. The staff proved to be like a warm family. They spent weekends and holidays together, and literally as soon as she moved to Novosibirsk, Natalia got married. She and her husband were given a room on Marine Avenue, the beautiful road running right through a pine glade. Everything worked out for the best. But best of all, naturally, was the work. Natalia landed in the laboratory at a key moment when they were developing the first manual on the volitional elimination of deep breathing. This wasn't just an in-house manuscript to be passed around between patients, but a real official handbook that would be printed in a state publishing house. That was where her acumen as a trainer came in handy. Dr. Buteyko had given instructions that patients were to be trained how to reduce the depth of their breathing in a number of ways, lying down, sitting up, reclining, and so on. And in each position, his top-class instruments would objectively quantify the volume of carbon dioxide in their body. They took readings while patients were walking and while they were doing exercise. Buteyko would always say, "We must develop and polish a technique that will be accessible to everyone and easily applicable." They worked themselves into the ground for laughably little money, but no one complained. The combined complexator could not stand idle. It cost too much. And after the breakaway from Professor Pomyekin, it virtually had a second life. "A proper handbook is essential," the exhausted doctor would remind them every so often, looking at the endless stream of patients. "However much you explain," he nodded at a patient lying on the special couch covered in a sheet, "there are still people who will forget it all and periodically start messing up the technique and themselves." Feathery snow fell outside the laboratory windows. 1964 approached, and the doctor began to get visibly worried. The publishers had already commissioned a handbook from them, but they had still to work out a definitive text. "You understand, Natalia," Buteyko turned to her again as she concentrated on a printout from the ballistocardiograph, "that a set of instructions will never be a substitute for a trainer. In that sense, any instructions are a nonsense. The method is like Tibetan medicine and can only be passed on from person to person. But a small handbook will, of course, be a good aide-memoire for those who have already undergone the course." As they heard this conversation, Kolya and Dima, the 2 extramural students from the biology faculty, lifted their heads from the equipment. "Absolutely," Kolya agreed, as tall and thin as a pole and whiter than any sheet. "Take that old dear, Mrs. Grekova. She needs a handbook just to get to the bathroom." Dima, his shorter colleague, with a blond beard, stifled a giggle at this. Kolya ignored him, straightened his rather grubby green tie, and continued, "Even if you drill it into her brain twice a day." "Who's Mrs. Grekova?" Natalia asked, marking something on a printout with her pencil. At that moment the laboratory door suddenly swung open, and 2 men carried in a white-haired old lady by the arms. She was bent double in an extremely severe attack. Her head rolled from side to side, and her wizened arms, held pinned at the elbows, continually shook. A harsh, asthmatic cough seemed to tear her in pieces. "Speak of the devil, here she is." Buteyko rolled the left sleeve of his lab coat further up and hurried over to their visitor. "Her again?" he asked the hefty man who had brought the old lady in and held her by the shoulders. The man wore stitched felt boots such as people wore in the countryside. Buteyko raised his voice a little as he spoke to him. "Was it the same as last time?" he asked, pushing a free chair towards the old lady. "Where else are we supposed to go, Dr. Buteyko?" the man said through his tears. Natalia found out that he was the patient's husband. "You are our only hope. She has been so bad recently. No medicines help, and none of the hospitals will take her. She's got worse and worse." He wiped his wet, wrinkled cheek. Now, Mrs. Grekova." Buteyko looked at the old woman, who guiltily avoided his eyes. "Please, come into my consulting room." He pointed to a curtain lifting slightly in the breeze. I would like to remind you, sirs," he added, for the benefit of the men accompanying her, "that if you have this sort of cavalier attitude to the method, it will be of no benefit to you at all. Worse than that, it might even be harmful. This is the 4th time in 18 months. Think about it." Dr. Buteyko shook his head sadly as he headed for his consulting room. "Miss Voronova, could you please come with us?" he threw over his shoulder as he went.